Hi, I'm Orbert Davis, and welcome to the Chicago Jazz Philharmonic JazzCast series, where we sit down with music legends as well as rising stars to hear their stories. This monthly series is all about sharing experience and knowledge with you. Thanks for tuning in. For more, visit chicagojazzphilharmonic.org. Let's do it.
Timuel, I wanted to start out by asking, what kind of music did you listen to when you were growing up?
Well, that's a very good question to ask because part of my family, my mother and her female sisters particularly, were so interested in breaking the barrier, integration, that they began to teach us early classical music, symphonic, Brahms, and all of that. And so I was exposed to that. But at the same time, they recognized that even though they enjoyed the music, they could not participate in the playing of that music. And so they also inserted into our lives, my brother and sister and I, jazz, blues. But on Sunday, we went to church and heard the spirituals. And during the rest of the week, we heard jazz and city blues and participated with our parents and with our friend in the bounce, the rhythm, and the lyrics of jazz and city blues throughout my childhood.
So when you were old enough, were there jazz clubs to go to?
Oh, yes, earlier. I wish I could remember the names, but 35th Street around State Street, where the Illinois Institute of Technology now exists, was a gathering ground for Black musicians, oral as well as there was theaters and jazz club, and oral as well as instrumental. And though my family lived south in the old Black Belt, my father would take us, my brother and I, to the Vendome or whatever that theater, and we began to hear Bessie Smith, and Louis Armstrong, and the others musicians that played in that theater. And so we enjoyed that because in our neighborhood where we lived at that time, the Grand Boulevard neighborhood, there were no opportunities to enjoy and hear that kind of music. And so I first heard Bessie Smith, Mamie Smith, Louis Armstrong, and other musicians, famous names that I can't remember right now, in that neighborhood, because even though the Black musicians might play at a white theater, which we couldn't go to, they would wind up playing in a competitive sort of way, a musical competitive at that movie theater house.
So then you went to high school at DuSable, right?
First, I went to Inglewood High School, then to what was then historic high school on the south side, Wendell Phillips. And that school had been dominantly white in the old days, but Blacks began to move into the Black Belt. I went to Phillips, and then they began, because of the overcrowded, we had double and triple the populations in adjoining white high school, and yet we couldn't go to those schools, which were nearby the neighborhood, but we couldn't go to them. And so as the Black population grew and became more and more political, that's another story of parallel institutions, parallel economic, parallel. I never worked outside the Black Belt until I went to college, parallel cultural, parallel political. In order to control that and contain it, the new building at 49th and Wabash and State Street was built to contain that overload. And initially it was named the New Wendell Phillips. But because the female residents, many of whom were college, used to meet at the Quincy Club, talk about the future of their children, And they demanded that the new building be named after the first non-native to settle on the banks of the Chicago River. His name was Jean-Baptiste Poit de Sable. He was the product of a Haitian mother and a French father, and he was reared in France, never had been in slavery. And he became a person that came to America to become a fur trader. And they demanded that that school be named after that first African-American. And because they were so politically organized, they changed the school name from New Winterfellows to Jean-Baptiste Poit de Sable. But pretty soon, jokesters were calling it Disable.
Oh,
And they changed the pronunciation to Du Sable.
oh,
Sorry to
that's
take
interesting.
the time, but that happened.
So there were a lot of famous jazz musicians who came out of DuSable High School.
Oh, yes.
You went to school with some of them. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, from the very beginning, a musician who had a college graduate, Fisk University, I believe, and who came from California, Captain Walt Henry Dad, took over the musical, the instrumental musical. And at that time, almost every school had that kind of specialization.
Mm.
And many of the jazz musicians who became outstandingly well known, and I wish I could name a few of them, but Nat King Cole, Dinah Washington, and others were part of that group, and they were beautiful. And after they graduated from high school, Captain Dad, he had connections with historically Black colleges and universities who were in the music, and many of them went to schools in the South, but they were also in the musical class. And I wish I could remember the names of some of them that became outstanding things. But your history makers, your history providers can get those names. Music was very important. Those of us who were not musicians listened to that music. And I was fortunate enough to have Nat King Cole sit right in back of me at DuSable and Phillips. And he talked music and I listened. And we had a player, we had a piano upright in that division room. And when teachers were absent or not present in the room, Nat Cole would play that music and we would listen.
That's back when there was a piano in every classroom in Chicago public schools.
That's right. Upright piano.
Yeah.
And someone in that classroom usually could play, whatever classroom.
Teachers were required to know how to play piano because music was important back in the day.
Music was very important because maybe if we were not academically inspired, the music would break us to the classroom. We would listen to the music, and then the teacher would teach whatever subject she or he specialized, whatever that subject was. We felt obligated. And later, as a teacher, when I was teaching at high school, not just DuSable, I would take a record player to my class and I would begin to play the music before the class was full, and my students would come, whether they were Black or white or Asian or what, they would be on time to listen to Mr. Black play the jazz music. And then I could teach whatever.
You know how to reel them in. Could you tell the story about going with your friends to hear Duke Ellington play that concert on the north side of the city?
Before we were drafted or went to the Army, Duke Ellington and jazz music was a part. And we heard Duke Ellington at the Regal Theater while we were still in elementary school. And we heard introducing Stephen Fetchit, the tap dancer. And we heard Duke being the background for Stephen Fetchit. And he was so unusual and we heard Johnny Hodges playing and other musicians. And so we made a commitment that if Duke Ellington was in town, we were going to see him. Well, we did. And during World War II, after Duke had traveled all over the world, written songs, Good Queen Bess, Serenade to Sweden, and so we heard that Duke Ellington was in town playing at a ballroom on the northwest side. We looked at one another and said, Duke's in town. And one of us said, come on, let's go. And we got into an automobile. By this time, we are old enough to drive and have a license. We got into the automobile. This is before the draft, before I was drafted to the Army. We got into the automobile with a couple of our friends and drove to that hall. And when we got up to the door, people were coming in rapidly and numerically. They told us there were no other tickets available. Well, one of the young ladies in our crowd said, tell Sonny Greer. And she gave her name. Sonny Greer came out and said, what are you doing out here? As if he didn't know. And we told him. And he went back, and Duke came out, and Duke said clearly to the manager of that theater or that ballroom, these are my guests. And if my guests cannot enjoy my presentation, this presentation is over. And so we went inside. They first hid us behind the curtains. There were about 5 of us. Duke stopped the music and repeated what he had said to the manager. These are my guests. And if my guests can't enjoy my presentation, this is over. Immediately, we became intermixed. And all we did was stand in front of the stage and talk about Duke Ellington's music. We didn't come there to dance, we came to hear Duke Ellington. And we had white friends, and those who were dancing, they just danced. But they didn't choose anyone by the color, and we didn't have any African-American young ladies with us. But they weren't interested in just dancing. They wanted to hear and be able to brag when they got to the old neighborhood. That's another problem. Yeah. Brag that they had heard Duke Ellington in this segregated condition. And that's part of the story of music. As Duke wrote, music is my mistress. Music was so important to many of us that it lines of race or gender, anything that might separate economic, because the music was what we enjoyed and could talk about together. And Duke personified that because he was internationalistic, proven by the songs that he would write that would be in honor of wherever he would be playing.
Can you, staying on the subject of Duke Ellington, can you tell us about the day that you introduced Dr. King to Duke Ellington?
Oh, yeah. To do a performance in Chicago in the downtown area. And that was at the same time we were planning a demonstration. I think it was Chicago housing demonstration with Dr. King. I was with Dr. King, and we were going to plan around and in McCormick Place, the beginning of whatever the march was going to be. So someone suggested that I take Dr. King down to McCormick Place so he could see that it wasn't as big, wasn't nearly as big, just one theater. And we were coming up step, and a man was talking over the telephone in the room that we were going to. And that was Duke Ellington. Dr. King said, "Oh, there's Duke Ellington." Duke looked around and saw Dr. King and said, "Oh, there's Dr. King." Well, almost immediately, they met together and shook hands as they talked to each other about how music was a very important part of the civil rights movement. And since I was not a musician, only a listener, and these two giants would talk with each other about how they could cooperate with one another, and they were talking about one another, to one another. And I was so proud that since I had met and knew both of them, I just listened to the conversation until it was completed. That, for me, was a famous day in history.
Yeah.
To bring two people of that kind of status together, and I was so proud because Dr. King called me Brother Black. Duke called me Tim. And so I felt an intimacy of relationship and proud that these two giants knew this dumb young man.
Well, I love that story. Thank you for telling it. The last question that I had that's been on my mind to ask you is what your thoughts are about the Black Lives Matters movement. We can all see that you're wearing a shirt that says Black Lives Matters. And we would love to hear you talk a little bit about what you think about what's going on these days and how young people and what young people might be able to do during this time.
That is a very recent dramatization and continuation of the struggle against racial segregation and discrimination. It was dramatized, however, by the shooting of a young man in Philadelphia who was shot as he was trying to move along at least 9 times. And there was an attempt to excuse the policeman who did that firing. Now, those who grew up in my period in the urban north can recall incidents similar to that, where a Black young man usually would be shot regardless. And we knew that if that person had been anything but Black, Caucasian or Asian or anything but Black, that person would not have been assassinated the same way that this young man and others had been assassinated. Now, one of the things that make me proud is the protest that says Black Lives Matter has been organized and participated in by young people across racial, ethnic lines, and they are not uninformed young people. But the friendliness for me is so encouraging for the future that we need now the cooperation and understanding and political action as well as social against the segregation that has existed all of our lives after slavery and all the other things, discrimination. When we are dedicated to the idea expressed in the Constitution that we hold these truths to be self-evident, not that all men, all human beings are created equal. That's our interpretation. And we're determined to make that come true because we at the same are all Americans. So we ask ourselves the question, why does race matter? And then we answer our own question, transferring that across the board universally with the statement, not the wondering, with the statement, Black Lives Matter. Black lives matter because human lives matter, and we are not going to be designated as being non-human. And so Black Lives Matter demonstration are forcing that thought into people who look or listen to the protests that are going on across the country.
I love that you boil it down to Black Lives Matter because human lives matter.
Yeah. And that's interesting because it's not giving the retort, all lives matter, to diminish the idea that Black lives matter. It's all human lives. And with that, you're going beyond race. You're saying that gender, culture, all these things, everything that's human. So
right.
Everything that's human. Thank you so much.
Is that clear? Is that answer the question?
It's the best I've ever heard of that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and say hi, Tim. Every time I get the chance to be in your presence is an honor. Thank you so much for being here.
We honor each other.
Yeah.
And this old man, along with your older relatives, tries to relate, and you're doing it, you younger people. And we just lost John Lewis, who was a friend of mine, also, who personified behaviorally as you do musically. The struggle goes on, but we shall overcome.
And you have gotten into a little bit of good trouble over your lifetime. As John says, we should all be getting ourselves into good trouble.
And have the bounce and rhythm of the music, which helps us to move along.
And kids should know that you have always supported in every way you could all of the jazz organizations and the jazz movements in Chicago, the Jazz Unites and the Jazz Institute and the Chicago Jazz Philharmonic and the Hyde Park Jazz Festival are all organizations that Tim has supported in word and in deed.
And played the music. If you've been here and seen all these records and stuff.
That's amazing.
You remember, Lauren?
Yeah.
These CDs and old time records, 7/8s.
Yeah, Tim actually, when I was the executive director at Jazz Institute of Chicago, and I was complaining that I just was working all of the time, and Tim said, the problem with you young people is you don't know how to relax. And he told me that his formula, which I'm sure has something to do with the fact that he's 102 years old, or almost 102, is that he would always come home no matter what he'd been doing and tell them what you do when you to relax.
I come home and I put on some old time jazz.
All right.
And I relax and go to bed. I used to drink a little Merlot, but I don't do that.
That was the part I remember too. He had a glass of wine and a good jazz set on his CD, and he knew how to relax.
Wow. Well, we have a student, Morgan Chapman, who's a drummer, says that he could talk to you forever on how your life has inspired America for hundreds of years to come. And I wanted to ask you, what advice can you give the students to understanding why jazz history is important for the future?
It's the idea that one of your friends, and I forget his name, musical friend, told me what jazz was like for him. He's a teacher at University of California, I believe. Mm-hmm. And that is the African beat and the European melody line. That was his expression of what jazz was is. And that's the combination that expresses unity and causes all of us to have a familiarity with this beautiful music because it is so universal. And as you know, you can go anywhere in the world and hear some jazz.
Yeah, and can communicate it with anyone over the world. As Lauren knows, in Poland.
Yeah.
Yeah, how musicians, and even in Cuba, students that or people who don't speak the same language can speak the language of jazz. Yeah. I like how you say it's a unifying factor. Because the fact that here we are in 2020 and we're experiencing disunity at a level that we've only known in our history. But I like how you say that jazz is a symbol for unity. That's really good.
Yep. Well, this might be a good place to end. Although we could go on talking for a couple of hours. So if you have any parting words for us, Tim, what would you like the students to most be thinking about for the rest of today and the rest of their lives, for that matter?
Right. Even us old students here.
Yes, especially.
I'd like them to carry the mission that was a part of the spirituality of my ancestors in a musical term. I'm so glad that trouble don't last always. That isn't jazz, but that's the spirit of jazz. The bounce carrying us from one day to another. And you can tell them that you heard this story from a guy who was 101 and 8 months old. And at the same time, trying to stimulate the idea that whatever the toughness may be, music can give the spirit of tomorrow. The rhythm, the lyrics, the combination of those skills can make us believe that the future is in our hands. Let's put on another record and dance.
That concludes this episode of the Chicago Jazz Philharmonic JazzCast series. We really appreciate you tuning in. Sharing these stories wouldn't be possible without the support of listeners like you. To hear previous episodes, or to make a donation, or to simply learn more about our mission, please visit us at chicagojazzphilharmonic.org. See you next time for the Chicago Jazz Philharmonic Conversation Series.